On the outside, John Gotti looked untouchable. Courthouse steps, cameras, suits, New York watching him like a movie star. But his downfall didn't start with a shootout. It started with something quieter, a habit. Because once you become a public legend, you stop hiding from patterns. And when patterns become visible, someone always starts aiming at them. New York didn't crown John Gotti in a back room. It crowned him in public. Flashbulbs, sidewalks, courthouse steps. The kind of attention most bosses avoided, because attention isn't just noise, it's a map. It teaches strangers where to look, when to show up, and what patterns to expect. But Gotti didn't treat attention like poison, he treated it like proof. And that single psychological mistake, the belief that being seen makes you untouchable, becomes the first crack in everything that follows. Because the Gotti myth wasn't an accident, it was built like a brand. The suits weren't vanity, they signaled control. The hair, the smile, the posture, each detail said, "I'm not a street animal, I'm above it." And what people miss is that this image doesn't only shape outsiders, it reshapes your own organization. The moment you become a symbol, your crew stops being a family and starts being an audience. Audiences don't protect you, they consume you, compare you, and whisper when you're not in the room. Under the old Gambino era, silence was camouflage. Power didn't need performance. Gotti flips the instinct. He becomes a public character inside the enterprise. And once you live as a character, you start making choices that keep the character alive, not the empire. At first, it looks like confidence. He learns the rhythm of cameras. He understands that in New York, perception can feel stronger than reality. Rivals hesitate. Cops look foolish when you walk free. Jurors wonder if the government is exaggerating. But perception changes your risk tolerance. A quiet boss avoids pressure. A loud boss starts believing pressure is survivable because he's already survived it. That's why the Teflon reputation is poisonous. It doesn't just tell the public charges don't stick. It tells the boss nothing sticks. So behavior that should have been temporary becomes routine. Same places, same circles, same habits. And law enforcement doesn't need you to be dramatic. It needs you to be consistent. A flashy gangster imagines danger as a gunman. A modern investigator knows danger looks like a schedule. Then there's the internal layer. Celebrity changes incentives. Under a quiet boss, loyalty is practical. It's the safest way to live. Under a loud boss, loyalty becomes theatrical. Men compete for proximity to the sun. They want credit, reputation, and a piece of the legend. And reputation is heat. Heat attracts cops, but it also attracts ambition, because the louder the boss becomes, the more people start asking the most dangerous question in organized crime. What happens if he disappears? That's where Gotti's personality matters. He didn't just crave control, he craved respect you could feel immediately. That makes leadership faster, more emotional, more reactive. It prioritizes being feared and admired over being invisible and stable. And even when it works short-term, it plants long-term consequences, resentment, quiet complaints, men keeping mental receipts. So the betrayal doesn't begin as an event, it begins as a psychology. Gotti didn't fall because he lacked intelligence. He fell because he misunderstood what his own myth was doing to him. He thought visibility was armor, but visibility is a spotlight that teaches the world where to aim. And in the next section, that spotlight gets deadlier because the throne Gotti takes isn't just a promotion, it's taken in a way that changes the family's chemistry forever. Once Gotti takes the top seat, something quietly dangerous happens. The boss stops being a rumor and becomes a public character. He uses visibility like a weapon. Reporters camp out, cameras catch the smile, and every courthouse walk feeds the illusion that the system can touch everyone except him. That's how the nicknames harden into legend. But the trap is simpler. The more famous you become, the less room you have to move. Every routine becomes a pattern, every meeting becomes a schedule, every friend becomes a map. Inside the family, fame rewires the chemistry. Street guys don't just want money, they want recognition. And when the boss is getting recognition from the outside world, everyone beneath him starts measuring status differently. Loyalty gets louder, pride bruises easier. And in this world, a bruised ego isn't just emotion, it's a future decision waiting for pressure. Gotti is building a myth that makes him bigger than the crew, and the crew feels it. Most retellings skip the real pivot. The government doesn't beat Gotti by suddenly getting smarter, they beat him by letting him keep talking. After his early wins, investigators lean into a slower strategy: accumulation, time, recordings, a case built from his own mouth. And the more Gotti loves being the center of the room, the more he gives them what they need: his voice, his complaints, his private judgments about the very men standing beside him. So the battleground shifts from the street to the room. The edge isn't tails and stakeouts, it's listening. Bugs, wiretaps, surveillance designed to capture not a headline, but a pattern of command. You can intimidate witnesses, you can't intimidate a microphone. You can scare people, you can't scare a tape. That's why the Ravenite era matters. The social club isn't just a hangout, it's a headquarters that feels safe because it's familiar. But familiarity is exactly what makes it vulnerable. Familiarity creates routine, and routine is how you get caught. Then comes the twist. Gotti tries to adapt, and the adaptation becomes proof. When he senses the street is too exposed, he moves upstairs, tighter circles, fewer people, more controlled spaces, smarter on paper. But the government targets those inner spaces too, turning the private room into evidence anyway. And now he isn't fighting rivals, he's fighting the reality that technology can sit silently in the corner and never blink. Worse, the tapes don't only capture orders, they capture personality. They catch the venting, the blame, the scorekeeping. And for a street-forward boss, that's fatal, because nothing fractures loyalty faster than men realizing the boss thinks they're disposable while they're already under pressure. Once that feeling spreads, loyalty stops being honor and starts feeling like a bad deal. By 1991 into early 1992, prosecutors are leaning hard on recordings, and the case begins to crystallize around a brutal idea. Gotti's own words can anchor the entire narrative, while Salvatore Gravano flips after indictment and becomes the witness who makes the story human and the evidence believable. And that's the cliff edge. Gotti doesn't lose because he suddenly gets weak on the street. He loses because in the one place he thought was safest, his own voice starts turning his inner circle into strangers. When people say Gotti was taken down by Sammy the Bull, it sounds clean. One betrayal, one witness, one domino. The truth is uglier. The betrayal didn't begin in a courtroom. It began in the one place Gotti thought was safest, a room where he spoke freely, certain he was untouchable. The government didn't need to invent a story about him. They only had to record him being himself long enough for his own organization to stop feeling like a family and start feeling like a liability. Here's the pivot. Gotti's power runs on loyalty and image, but his leadership style manufactures disloyalty. On the tapes, you don't just hear business, you hear judgment, blame, a constant instinct to protect the legend by pushing risk downward. And the man absorbing that pressure is Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, practical, survival-driven, and crucially, the kind of underboss who does the dirty work that keeps a boss clean. Gravano can live with violence. What he can't live with is becoming the fall guy for someone else's ego. So the betrayal isn't a single act of cowardice. It's a slow conversion of self-preservation into a plan. Under federal pressure, men do math in the dark. Years, decades, birthdays missed, children aging without them. And then the colder realization hits. The boss isn't going to save you. He's going to use you. That's when loyalty dies, not when a prosecutor speaks, but when your own boss convinces you you're disposable. By late 1990, the pressure stops being abstract. Gotti is arrested and the government comes in heavy, not with one neat homicide case, but with an anatomy lesson: racketeering, conspiracy, patterns of command. A RICO-style case doesn't need a trigger in your hand. It needs to show you were the system, the gravity that made other men move. Gotti had survived by turning trials into theater: suits, smirks, headlines, juries watching a celebrity. But the government adapts, security tightens, the jury is shielded, the showmanship gets boxed in. A celebrity boss is strongest when the room feels like a stage. He's weakest when the room feels like a lab. Then Gravano flips, and the case becomes irreversible. The government doesn't just get a witness, it gets an interpreter, someone who can translate taped phrases to street decisions, connect vague talk to real orders, and explain hierarchy like management. Now the jury isn't just hearing about Gotti, it's seeing the structure he tried to keep invisible, made legible by the man who used to sit beside him. The irony is that Gotti helps create the betrayal through how he handles fear. Some bosses tighten quietly under pressure. Gotti tightens emotionally, complains, suspects, tests loyalty in ways that feel personal. And personal tests create cracks, because men will tolerate risk for money, but they won't tolerate humiliation for long when the risk becomes decades. So by 1992, the trial feels less like a duel and more like doors closing. The prosecution brings the two weapons Carlo Gambino feared most: recordings and cooperation. The defense can argue interpretation and credibility, but credibility is a thin shield when the evidence isn't memory. It's the boss's own voice, captured over time, calm and confident at the center of it all. When the verdict comes, guilty, the myth hits something it can't charm: procedure, sentencing, paper. Gotti, who built his identity on being seen as untouchable, becomes the most visible kind of vulnerable, a man trapped in a courtroom by his own words. And the tragedy isn't only that he loses, it's what the loss exposes. Gotti miscalculated the psychology of his inner circle under modern pressure. He believed charisma could outweigh risk, and loyalty was permanent. He learns, too late, that loyalty is a mood, and moods collapse the moment men start hearing the word life. That sets up the next section. Prison doesn't just remove a boss from the street, it rewrites what his name means, reshapes the family without him, and forces one final question. Once the Teflon myth is gone, what is John Gotti without the spotlight, and what happens to an empire that was built to be watched?
Gotti didn't become dangerous because he was invisible. He became dangerous because he was visible in the one way a courtroom can't ignore. The moment Paul Castellano is murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, the street doesn't just watch a boss fall, it watches a new style of leadership step into the light. And Gotti doesn't resist that light, he feeds on it. That's the contradiction baked into his downfall. Carlo Gambino's era treated attention like poison. Gotti treats attention like proof of life. Expensive suits, public swagger, a cadence that feels built for cameras, even when no cameras are supposed to be there. The press hands him nicknames that sound like movie titles. First the Dapper Don, then the Teflon Don, because early on charges don't seem to stick. But the part an erudite audience sometimes underrates is this: those acquittals weren't just legal wins, they were psychological wins. A man doesn't only learn I beat the government, he learns I'm built different. And once that belief settles into your bones, it rewires your risk. It changes what you say in rooms. It changes how you treat allies. It changes whether you listen when older men tell you to lower your profile. Because Gotti's Teflon phase isn't only about court, it's about the street watching. Every time he walks out smiling, every time headlines frame him as untouchable, his internal gravity gets stronger. Guys who would have stayed quiet under a boss like Gambino start leaning toward the man who looks like the future. And under Gotti, the future doesn't look like silence, it looks like legend. And legend has a cost. It demands repetition. A quiet boss can survive by doing less. A famous boss survives by being seen doing something. Seen at the club, seen at the ritual, seen as the center of a living myth. That creates the exact problem Gambino built his entire philosophy to avoid: patterns. This is where the government finally gets a weapon that doesn't care how feared you are. Time plus surveillance plus routine. While the city watches suits and swagger, a second audience watches something colder. Who meets who, how often, where, and why. Orbits can be mapped. If you're a prosecutor, that's the real story you want. Not a gangster did a gangster thing, but this is an enterprise, a machine. And you want to show the jury the machine has a driver. That's why the Teflon era is secretly the beginning of the end. Every public victory encourages behavior that makes the next case easier. Every time Gotti looks untouchable, it increases temptation inside the circle to cut corners, lean on people, speak too freely, treat the world like it's already surrendered. And the most fatal part is this: intimidation works best when everyone believes the system is stable, but stability becomes fragile when your boss is a celebrity. Celebrity attracts hunger, hunger attracts ego, ego attracts mistakes, and mistakes create opportunities for the one force every boss fears more than police: a resentful insider with a reason to save himself. Because informants aren't random lightning strikes, they're manufactured by pressure and emotion. A man flips when the math changes, yes, but also when the story in his head changes. The boss won't protect me. I'm disposable. This isn't a family, it's a ladder, and I'm the rung. So even as Gotti's image grows, the internal climate shifts. A Teflon boss feels like a blessing until you realize what he really is: a magnet. He pulls heat toward the entire family, even when he swears he's protecting it. And as that heat builds, crews stop thinking in years. They start thinking in months, in weeks, in what happens if they actually make this one stick. That's why the government doesn't need to beat Gotti at his most powerful. It only needs to wait until he becomes predictable, until the myth forces him to keep showing up in the same places, saying the same things, trusting the same people, repeating the same rhythms. Then, in December 1990, the trap tightens. Gotti is arrested and hit with multiple charges: racketeering, extortion, jury tampering, and more. This time, the state treats the intimidation problem like part of the case itself: an anonymous jury, numbers instead of names, a courtroom engineered to resist fear. That detail matters because it signals a shift. He's no longer being handled like just another defendant. He's being handled like an ecosystem. And that's when the Teflon illusion starts to peel. Not because Gotti suddenly becomes weak, but because the world around him is getting smarter. Fear doesn't work the same way on procedure, sealed identities, and paper. So the story turns darker than the flashy Don finally gets caught. It becomes a private countdown inside his own circle. Because once the case feels airtight, the real question isn't whether the government can prove it. It's who breaks first.
After Appalachian, Gambino learned the new enemy was visibility. John Gotti learned the opposite lesson. Visibility could be armor. He turned the boss role into a spotlight, suits, headlines, courthouse swagger, and every time he walked out smiling, the myth hardened. Teflon Don didn't just mean cases slid off. It meant the public started believing nothing could stay on him long enough to become permanent. But the government stopped trying to beat him with one dramatic punch. They went after him the way Gambino once built power, through pattern, routine, repetition. A RICO case doesn't need one dirty moment. It needs the system and the man who commands it. So the strategy becomes patience, long surveillance, long listening, and a focus not on Gotti the celebrity, but Gotti the administrator. Because the most dangerous thing to a boss isn't a rival gun, it's his own mouth when he thinks the room is safe. That's where the case turns psychological. Gotti keeps talking like a boss, keeps handling disputes, keeps living inside familiar rhythms, and recordings turn those rhythms into evidence. Slowly, the myth loses its magic. Not overnight, the way an image fades when you see it too many times in harsh light. Then comes the pressure point Gambino always feared more than rivals, the moment loyalty becomes negotiable. Silence only works if everyone under you can afford it. By this era, the price of silence is measured in decades. The internal math flips from "do I respect him" to "do I want to die in prison?" That's why Sammy Gravano is lethal to Gotti's story. He isn't a headline myth, he's operational spine. And when an underboss cooperates, it isn't just another witness, it's an interpreter who can translate tapes, hierarchy, and coded language into a clean narrative jurors can hold. Once that line is crossed, the old fog, they can't prove it, starts to rot from the inside. It also rewrites status. If the underboss says the boss is guilty, the boss stops feeling untouchable. He feels exposed because the family itself can't guarantee silence anymore. That's the moment the Teflon legend becomes something stickier. Even the mob museum summarizes the shift with a brutal line. The Teflon Don had become the Velcro Don. From there, the trial stops being a spectacle and becomes countdown. On April 2, 1992, Gotti is convicted. A few months later, on June 23, 1992, he's sentenced to life without parole. Those dates are the exact pivot from "he always gets away" to "this time he doesn't." Not because he became less dangerous, but because the system learned how to lock onto him without needing him to be loud. And that's the cliff edge. The conviction doesn't just remove a boss, it damages the belief in the ceiling above everyone's ambition. If this boss can fall, any boss can fall. And once that thought enters the bloodstream, the next era isn't ruled by confidence, it's ruled by paranoia. For years, Gotti's greatest weapon wasn't a gun. It was the feeling the system couldn't stick to him. Trials came and went, juries came back clean, witnesses evaporated, and the legend did the rest. Teflon Don wasn't just a nickname. Inside the family, it became protection, almost superstition. Why doubt the man who keeps walking out of court? But superstition collapses the moment reality produces something you can't argue with, evidence you can hear. By the late 1980s, the government stops treating Gotti like a celebrity and starts treating him like an executive. The goal shifts from catching him doing something to proving he runs the system. That's the racketeering logic. You don't need the boss holding the bag if you can show the bag exists because the boss built the machine. And Gotti's machine leaves the one thing prosecutors love: patterns. The FBI approach turns patient and clinical. Surveillance, routines, repeated entrances, the same handshakes, the same rooms. A boss who built authority on being visible now has to live with the modern truth. Being seen is also being recorded. And the real trap isn't a raid, it's the quiet room where your own voice becomes a witness. Listening coverage gets close enough to turn daily life into transcripts. The tapes don't just capture business, they capture tone, hierarchy, and how Gotti talks when he thinks the room belongs to him. And that's where the story turns darker. Gotti doesn't rule like Gambino, he rules through presence. So he talks, vents, judges, assigns blame out loud. Strategy becomes personality. Personality becomes evidence. That's what poisons the inner circle. Because recordings don't only build the government's case, they build resentment. A tape can do what rivals can't. It can prove disrespect. Sammy the Bull Gravano isn't just any underboss. He's the operational spine that made Gotti's reign possible while Gotti absorbed the spotlight. But once prosecutors start stacking decades, 25 years stops being a number and becomes a life sentence you can picture. Loyalty starts competing with survival, and survival always argues better, especially if the boss you're risking everything for sounds like he's already positioning you as disposable. So Gravano's choice isn't honor versus cowardice, it's simple math. Die in prison for a boss who's blaming you, or turn the machine into testimony and buy time. And once a cooperating insider can narrate the structure from the inside out, the Teflon era is over. From there, the end becomes procedural. On April 2nd, 1992, Gotti is convicted. On June 23rd, 1992, he's sentenced to life without parole. The myth doesn't vanish overnight, but its core promise dies on paper. I can always beat this. And that's the real dethroning. The legend that once protected him becomes a magnet for scrutiny. The name that once inspired silence starts inspiring ambition. Because once everyone sees that John Gotti can be put away for life, the family learns the same lesson at once. Nobody is safe. And if nobody is safe, loyalty becomes a luxury. And that sets up the next section. Prison doesn't just remove Gotti from the street, it forces him to rule through distance while his body, his family, and his myth begin unraveling in slow motion.
John Gotti didn't lose because he suddenly got unlucky. He lost because the world he mastered, face-to-face loyalty, street pressure, fear as currency, collided with something colder, recorded reality. In the old days, you could survive an accusation if nobody could prove it. In the new days, you could look innocent, smile for cameras, walk out of court, and still be destroyed by a voice on tape. Gotti didn't get beaten by a bigger crew, he got beaten by a smaller room. And that was the first irreversible mistake. That's the irony of his reign. He looked like a modern boss, sharp suits, public confidence, a man who seemed to turn courtrooms into stages. But the trait that made him powerful, his need to be seen, to be heard, to be respected in real time, kept him close to the one vulnerability Carlo Gambino feared most: information that doesn't forget. By the late 1980s into 1990-1991, federal pressure isn't just watching the street, it's learning the internal language of the organization, who gives the nod, who repeats instructions, who's present when decisions get made. Once investigators have audio that captures hierarchy in motion, the case changes shape. Lawyers can argue, crews can deny, but prosecutors don't need mythology anymore. They can play the structure out loud. And when the structure becomes audible, the legend starts to rot, quietly, clinically, on schedule. This is where most retellings get lazy and jump straight to Sammy the Bull. But the real turning point isn't a courtroom betrayal, it's an internal psychological fracture. Because informants don't appear out of thin air, they appear when a man realizes the organization's protection is conditional and the bill is about to land on him personally. The tapes didn't just capture crimes, they captured tone, judgment, blame. And that matters more than people admit, because the fastest way to kill loyalty isn't fear, it's humiliation under pressure. The moment a man believes he's being positioned as the fall guy, he stops thinking like a soldier and starts thinking like a survivor. And that's the moment the family splits, even before anyone flips. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano is remembered as the guy who cooperated. The uncomfortable truth is that cooperation became possible because Gotti's leadership style made it feel rational. A street-forward boss who rules through presence talks, he vents, he keeps score, he protects his image by pushing responsibility downward. And once prosecutors are stacking decades, once 25 years stops being a number and becomes a vision of your life ending under fluorescent lights, survival argues better than tradition, especially if you're risking everything for a boss whose own words are already turning you into a shield. That's the brutal twist. A tape can do what no rival boss can do. It can prove disrespect. And once disrespect is provable, loyalty becomes negotiable. So when Salvatore "Sammy" Gravano decides to cooperate, it isn't just one man flipping, it's an extinction-level shift in the culture. Because now the government doesn't only have surveillance, it has an interpreter, someone who can listen to a tape and explain what it means in the language of the street, someone who can connect vague phrases to real decisions, someone who can point at a hierarchy and say, this wasn't random violence, this was management. And once you have both, recordings plus a high-ranking insider, the jury doesn't need to believe in the mafia, they only need to believe their own ears. That's when the trap becomes a countdown. Because when the story is that clean, there's no room left for the old magic. On April 2nd, 1992, Gotti is convicted. On June 23rd, 1992, he's sentenced to life without parole. The dates matter because they mark the exact moment the myth flips from he always gets away to this time he doesn't. Not because he suddenly became less dangerous, but because the system learned how to lock onto him without needing him to be loud. And here's the part that should feel colder than the verdict itself. The conviction doesn't just remove a boss, it removes faith in the ceiling above everyone's ambition. If John Gotti can be put away for life, then nobody is safe. And if nobody is safe, then loyalty becomes a luxury, which means the real downfall isn't the courtroom, it's what the cage does to the empire once the spotlight is gone. A life sentence doesn't just remove a man from the street, it removes the story he used to control. And for John Gotti, that was the real punishment. Prison didn't only take his freedom, it took his stage. The silk suits, the courthouse grin, the camera-friendly swagger, all of that collapses the moment the door closes and the world stops reacting to you. Because Gotti's power was never just the rackets, it was the feeling he gave people, the idea that he could bend reality with confidence alone. But in federal prison, confidence is just a personality trait. The schedule doesn't care. From the outside, people imagine the aftermath like a clean cut. Boss goes away, family continues, life moves on. But inside an organization built on reputation, a conviction like that is a chemical spill. It doesn't explode, it spreads. It changes how people talk, how they trust, how they calculate risk.
because now everyone has proof that the modern government can do something the old street code was never designed to handle. It can turn loyalty into recorded speech, into courtroom narrative, into decades behind bars. And once a family experiences that kind of pressure, the culture shifts from pride to survival. That's why the years after the conviction feel less like a gangster movie and more like a slow institutional autopsy. The myth of the Teflon Don doesn't die in one dramatic moment. It dies in repetition. Years of controlled movement, monitored contact, limited access, a life reduced to routine. And what makes it worse is that Gotti isn't built for quiet disappearance. He's built for presence. So prison doesn't just punish him physically, it erases the mechanism he used to stay dominant: visibility. Meanwhile, the family he left behind is forced into a reality it didn't choose. The government doesn't stop at the headline conviction, it keeps squeezing the ecosystem. When law enforcement gets a win that big, it doesn't relax, it learns, it builds confidence, it expands. And that pressure spreads through crews like weather. People start talking differently on phones, people avoid gatherings, people become paranoid about who might be listening, who might be scared, who might be tempted. Because after a betrayal like Gravano's, the most dangerous thing isn't a rival family, it's the idea that the next betrayal could come from anyone who decides prison is worse than shame. This is where Gotti's tragedy becomes almost ironic. He spent years turning himself into a public symbol of strength, but the legacy he leaves is a private environment of fear. Not fear of him, fear of the consequences attached to his era. Because a flashy boss trains the government where to look, a loud rain teaches investigators what patterns matter, and when those patterns get mapped, the organization doesn't just lose a leader, it loses innocence. You can also feel another quiet loss happening, control of the narrative inside his own world. When you're on the street, even rumors can be managed. You can reward, punish, intimidate, correct. From prison, you're forced into distance, and distance creates interpretation. People begin to tell themselves stories about what you would want, what you would allow, who you would back. And those stories are rarely neutral. They become political tools. They become excuses. They become leverage. The boss's name turns into a currency other men spend. And then comes the oldest enemy of all, the body. For years, Gotti had lived like a man who believed time was something that happened to other people. But prison time is different. It stretches, it slows, it forces you to live inside long horizons, and eventually, reality arrives in a form that no amount of street reputation can negotiate with: illness. The later stage of his life becomes defined by decline, hospital visits, medical confinement, a kind of ending that feels brutally uncinematic for a man who once controlled the frame. That's part of why his death lands the way it does. John Gotti doesn't die in a blaze of violence or a final showdown. He dies removed from the world he once dominated, the legend separated from the living man, the myth outlasting the body. And if you're trying to understand the real downfall, that's the point. The government didn't just imprison him, it outlasted him. It turned his reign into a cautionary tale for everyone still outside, proof that the spotlight he loved could also become the cleanest target. But here's the final twist that makes his story linger. Even after he's gone, the style he represented doesn't disappear. In a strange way, it becomes contagious. Younger men learn the wrong lesson. They don't see the quiet suffocation, they see the fame, the swagger, the cultural footprint. And that creates a dangerous cycle inside organized crime. The same kind of personality that attracts attention also attracts imitators, which means the Gotti era doesn't end with his sentence. It echoes, first as fear, then as temptation, then as repetition. So when people ask why his downfall feels tragic instead of simply deserved, the answer isn't sympathy, it's structure. He didn't just lose because he broke laws, he lost because he built a kingdom that depended on being seen, and the moment being seen became evidence, the entire foundation flipped against him. A quiet boss can survive in shadows for decades. A loud boss eventually teaches the world exactly where to aim. And if you want the real final note, John Gotti wasn't the last gangster to discover that the most terrifying kind of takedown doesn't come with gunfire. It comes with patience, paperwork, and time. And if you want more stories like this, tragic, eerie, and full of the kind of internal collapses people don't notice until it's too late, we've left a full playlist right here, because Gotti wasn't the only king whose fall was darker than anyone expected.